You hear slogans every day and you think they're just words. But the truth is uglier. Language is an operating system. And for a long time, China's most powerful minds have been upgrading that operating system until it can run a whole society without you ever noticing the switch. Most people in the West treat politics like weather. It happens out there to other people somewhere behind glass. You watch it, you comment on it, you move on. But when a regime learns how to write reality, it doesn't just control institutions. It controls what citizens can imagine. It controls what feels normal, what feels moral, what feels shameful, and what feels like your choice, even when your choices have been shaped in advance. This video isn't about China as a distant geopolitical story. It's about a more universal psychological mechanism, how power survives by hijacking meaning, how leaders turn ideology into management software, how a system manufactures consent by making obedience feel like virtue, and how one man, Vuong in the transcript's framing, becomes less a person and more a metaphor for what elite systems do best. They build a brain. Let's talk about the three layers of language that the transcript calls classic strategies, but I want you to stop thinking of them like separate political phases. Think of them like stages in a single method. First, a crisis of legitimacy, then, a crisis of social stability, then, a crisis of sustainability, trust, and performance. Each time, the system doesn't merely react, it redefines reality. It changes the words people use to describe themselves. And once enough people repeat those words, the system doesn't have to use brute force as much, because the population becomes its own compliance department. So here's the uncomfortable promise of this channel. I will not flatter your intelligence. If you want a clean, comforting story, go somewhere else. If you want the hidden self behind how systems recruit loyalty and how individuals recruit themselves into that loyalty, keep listening. In the first era described here, the transcript frames the period after the Tiananmen shock in 1989 as a legitimacy crisis. That's the phrase, but translate it into psychology and you get something more personal. A legitimacy crisis is when the old story stops working in the minds of the public. It's when people no longer feel pride in the official narrative. It's when, because the party says so, stops generating the emotional energy that obedience requires. After Tiananmen, you can imagine the internal panic in a ruling system. Not panic like chaos, panic like calibration. The regime realized something dangerous. You can't imprison a question. You can delay it, suppress it, punish it, but you can't fully stop the mind from asking, why should I believe this? If the answer is only fear, then every future stability strategy must be thicker, harsher, more expensive. And then the external world collapsed too. The Soviet bloc fell like dominoes. People don't just watch regimes fail, they internalize the lesson. The story dies. That's why legitimacy crises are existential. They threaten not only control, but identity. They attack the role people have been taught to play. Now notice the genius and the cruelty in the transcript's claim. The system solution wasn't a new weapon. It was a new vocabulary. It needed a language that could carry authority across a world that was changing fast. The country was moving toward market economics, growing private interests, creating a new social layer. Yet the party's traditional ideology was built for a different world. A world where private capital was treated as a class enemy. You can't govern a growing class with language that calls that class poison. So the transcript introduces three represents, described as a shift in what the party claims to represent. On paper, it sounds like an ideological update. In practice, it is an emotional rescue operation for the ruling identity. The system needed to reframe entrepreneurs and private business figures as compatible with the party, not contaminating to it. It needed a story that allowed everyone to stop feeling like the world was betraying the official worldview. The psychological move here is called semantic redefinition. It sounds academic, but it's brutally simple. If you change the labels, you change what people feel obligated to do. In the transcript, the key is that the language moves from capital toward advanced productive forces, toward advanced culture, and toward the broad interests of the majority of the people. Listen carefully to that last phrase, broad interests of the majority. That's the universal solvent of politics. It is vague enough to swallow almost anything. It can justify policy aimed at stability, growth, punishment, surveillance, or reform. It can be used as a shield by the rulers and as a mirror by the citizens. Citizens can repeat it without confronting what they might actually be suffering. This is what elite systems do. They don't just claim power, they claim moral interpretation. They build a moral funnel, and then they push people's thoughts through it until dissent becomes unthinkable. Here's a micro story you might recognize if you've ever been in a workplace with a culture campaign. The organization says it supports you. It posts values on walls, but it's not really for your benefit. It's to make loyalty feel like professionalism. It's to make criticism feel like disloyalty. The company turns language into a behavioral leash, and your brain learns to self-censor so it can avoid shame. That is the same mechanism described in the transcript, just scaled up to the level of a state. Entrepreneurs were not merely allowed to exist, They were absorbed into the identity of the party by being translated into the party's moral grammar. A businessman becomes not a threat, but a contributor to development. A capitalist becomes an advanced productive force. It's a translation of moral status. And once the moral status is translated, institutional changes follow. The transcript describes party membership opening to private entrepreneurs, party committees inside private firms, and a broadened united front structure that reaches professional associations and social networks. Again, notice the psychological method. Influence first through meaning, then through structure, then through oversight. The system doesn't start with surveillance. It starts with the idea that collaboration is virtue. Why does this work? Because humans are not built to handle contradiction comfortably. If the world says we are at war with capital, but reality says capital is necessary for growth, people experience cognitive dissonance. They can either admit the contradiction publicly, or they can adopt the new language that dissolves it. Most people choose dissolution. They want internal peace. They want to stop feeling like they're living two lives. This is the part where the transcript claims something darker. By legalizing this semantic shift, the party legitimized the existence of a class it once condemned without giving up the political monopoly. So you get a hybrid outcome, economic privatization paired with political autocracy. That combination is a psychological trap for society. Private wealth expands, but the rules of political reality remain fixed. This creates a slow corrosion of trust. Yes, in the short term, the transcript notes growth. High growth is like anesthesia. It numbs the pain of contradictions. If people are getting richer, they assume the system is fair. They confuse economic performance with moral legitimacy. And that's another truth people hide from themselves. Many people don't really believe in ideologies. They believe in outcomes. When outcomes look good, they forgive the ideology. When outcomes look bad, they stop forgiving. But long term, the transcript points to structural corruption, regional inequality, environmental damage, and the formation of a power alliance between local officials and favored business groups. The regime may be rewarding itself to survive, but the real world keeps producing incentives, and incentives produce behavior. If you create a system where the party can define virtue yet cannot allow meaningful power sharing, then corruption doesn't disappear, it adapts. So the first strategy in the transcript is fix legitimacy by expanding the moral language of who the party represents. It allows the economy to grow while keeping political dominance. It builds a bridge from old ideology to new economic reality. But it also plants seeds of contradiction, because when you absorb the private class into political control without granting rights, you don't create harmony. You create dependency. That dependency becomes explosive later. And this brings us to the next era described in the transcript, the time when stability becomes the overriding value. After economic transformation, society doesn't remain one block. It splinters into interests. It creates new frustrations. Urban and rural life diverge. Environmental degradation becomes visible. Disputes escalate. The transcript describes protests, collective petitions, and a general sense that the social fabric is tearing. Now translate this into psychology. Stability is what you seek when meaning is too contested to manage openly. When people no longer trust the legitimacy story, they begin to test it, they bargain, they resist, they complain. And when the system can't respond with democratic legitimacy, it responds with operational legitimacy, control, enforcement, and administrative management. But brute force has costs. It costs money. It costs international reputation. It costs the party's own image as protector of order and morality. And in the transcript's framing, another fear looms in the background, the memory of Tiananmen. If you overuse coercion, you risk a second rupture. So the system seeks a new language that can make control feel less violent. That is where the transcript's harmonious society comes in. It sounds soothing. Even the words are soft. But softness is often a disguise. In psychological terms, harmony is what you use when you want to suppress conflict without actually resolving its causes. If you teach people that disagreement equals disorder, then you can label any resistance as immorality. If you teach people that questioning equals sabotage, then you can frame censorship as civic duty. You can build a society where people self-police their thoughts because they've learned that dissent is not just illegal but ugly. In the transcript, harmonious is tied to a Confucian idea, not equality, but ordered placement. The ruler defines the arrangement. Individuals know their positions. They contribute to a managed whole. It's not justice, it's coordination. It's social engineering dressed as ethics. Let's make this personal. Have you ever been in a group conversation where the wrong topic gets shut down, not by argument, but by moral framing? Someone says, let's keep things respectful, even though they are refusing to address the substance. Someone says, don't cause trouble, even though trouble is just the discomfort of truth. That's harmony as control. It doesn't eliminate conflict. It relocates conflict into silence. That silence is useful to power. Silence reduces unpredictability. Silence hides grievances from each other. Silence prevents collective identity from forming. And once a society becomes skilled at silence, the system can govern with fewer open confrontations. The transcript describes how the system extends soft power mechanisms: internet governance, narrative management, censorship framed as maintenance of public order, and an emphasis on civilized conduct. It describes budgets for public security exceeding even defense spending. That's important. It means harmony is not gentle. Harmony is administered. It's a managed atmosphere. Now, here's where people miss the psychological depth. The most effective control is not the control that makes you afraid. It's the control that makes you complicit. When the regime can convince you that your silence is moral, you become a partner in your own reduction. The transcript also describes data-driven governance, scoring officials based on performance metrics like economic growth, poverty reduction, and social order, while building surveillance systems for petitions, media warnings, and community monitoring. This is control through measurement. It is also control through fear of being measured wrong. Think about your own life for a second. When you know you're being evaluated with numbers, what do? You optimize what will be scored. You stop doing what is not measurable. You begin to manage perception, not reality. That's what happens when governance becomes a spreadsheet. Stability becomes an output. Trust becomes irrelevant because trust can't be plotted as cleanly as arrests or reports. And the transcript points to the consequences. An economy where local governments are trapped by debt and investment demands, data that gets manipulated, innovation constrained by tight power structures. This is the hidden cost of harmony as ideology. It makes coordination easier, but it makes truth harder. Eventually, the system faces a new legitimacy problem. Not because it didn't have stories. It had too many stories, too many soft labels, too much data management that couldn't fully mask reality. People live in the gap between official language and lived experience. Over time, the gap creates cynicism. Cynicism is dangerous because it turns obedience into habit, not belief. Habit still works for a while, but it doesn't generate loyalty under stress. So then the transcript moves to the next era, the era of China Dream, described as the project of the current leader. And here the pattern repeats, but with a critical escalation. The system doesn't just reframe legitimacy or stability, it redefines the nation's future as an emotional mission, and it centralizes power to execute it. By now, you should see the architecture. First, legality and moral inclusion for economic transition. Second, ethical language for control and social silence. Third, total mobilization language for performance, survival, and dominance. But the psychological mechanism changes again. In China Dream, the regime tries to make the citizen's identity merge with the state's identity. Not just the party governs you. More like the nation's destiny is your destiny. That kind of merger is not a slogan. It's a psychological claim about who you are, and the transcript frames the motivations. Economic headwinds like the middle income trap, productivity stagnation, technological dependence on the West, internal corruption that erodes trust, and concerns about the overall efficiency of the system after decades of development. External strategic rivalry is also rising, so the regime needs a new narrative to keep both believers and opportunists aligned. Narrative for a mature contradiction has to do more than promise improvement. It has to manufacture meaning in the face of fatigue. People who have lived through decades of propaganda learn skepticism. They need a story that feels personal again. They need emotional intensity, not just policy rationalization. The transcript claims that the designer behind this language is again the same figure, Vuong Ning, described as someone who doesn't merely write slogans but engineers political reality. Whether or not you accept every claim, you should understand the function. The system needs a brain that turns ideology into operational capacity. And this is what China Dream represents in the transcript, not only a vision but a governance mechanism, a machine that can mobilize the whole country as if society were one coordinated organism. In that organism, the individual is a component, the party is the control system, the dream is the motivational interface. Now, the transcript describes the three main policy pillars. First, anti-corruption on a massive scale. Second, economic restructuring towards self-reliance with projects like industrial upgrading, data security, platform governance, and crackdowns framed as regulation and fairness. Third, military modernization and expanded international influence through alliances and infrastructure. Let's interpret the first pillar psychologically. Massive anti-corruption campaigns are